Welcome to Office Hours 16. I'm Peter Bull, and I'm here with Philip Gant. We had a great response to the end of the course survey. Even a greater percentage of people are answering the surveys now than in the past. At this moment, the surveys sort of are reaffirming what we think, which is that the course is going pretty well. Most of you are very satisfied or satisfied. Really interesting fact that came through. Many of you are, it seems, on average, you're spending 5 hours a week on a module. I have to admit that's better than Harvard students. I'm ashamed to admit. Philip, however, he's a good student, so he really works hard. Brief announcement, edX will generate new certificates every 4 months. So if you go back and do earlier modules, it will take a while for edX to get you the certificate, but they will come. There are some questions. Well, there is a question here. We'll post this, and we'll have some more surveys for you too, where we actually want to find out some more information. But Philip, I saw that there was students had a problem with one of the questions.
Right. We've started instituting a not type question,
Right.
So which of the following does not apply, and also a multiple answers apply type question.
Mm-hmm.
And this first question here, I think, gave learners a bit of a hard time.
Mm-hmm.
It was asking about thinking about the difference in dynastic versus periodic thinking.
Thinking in terms
time.
of dynasties versus major social, economic, cultural changes.
Right.
Okay, right. And the correct answers to that were, A, dynasties are political periods defined by the existence of an imperial house, which is true.
Yes.
And socio-cultural periods are not. And you know, actually we know that because we see that major socio-cultural shifts don't take place together with a dynastic change, right? And so continually sort of the political changes of dynasties and socio-cultural change are not in sync, even though we sometimes try to make them look like that. Second answer that was also correct is dynasties have the advantage of defining the shared consciousness of time. And I think that's very important actually, because a dynasty may not define social change or economic change even, but dynasty is something everybody knows about who lives in that world. Do you know how they know about it?
The calendar.
The calendar,
tells them that?
exactly,
Yes.
exactly. The calendar says this is the reign period title of such and such a year, and of the current emperor, and this is the year and that, and so on. And I think it's one thing that actually probably most people knew is the name of our dynasty, the period we're living in.
But what about a period, Professor? Would people be conscious that they're
No, I
living
don't
in a
think so.
period?
Not necessarily at all.
Okay.
No, not necessarily. They, after the fact, they go back and look and say, oh, that's when this big change took place. In this next part of the course, we'll be talking about Neo-Confucianism, a new kind of Confucianism. It emerges really in the late 11th century, but it's not till the 12th century, and people say, oh, this is this new learning of the way that we've developed, and this is now sort of a dominant sort of thing. The social culture periods define economic and social conditions to which dynasties respond. Well, this is a question that I made up, and so I apologize. It's my fault, obviously, that this was a problem. But what I was trying to get at was that a sociocultural period has certain kinds of economic formations. Its society is changing in certain ways. There's certain kinds of cultural things that have happened. And for a dynasty to survive, it has to be able to respond to those changes. And so rather than a dynasty defining historical change or how society changes, I think it's society that creates the conditions that a dynasty, a political order, has to respond to. And that's why I disagree with D, that changes in society and economy result from the founding of a new dynasty. And it's why E is wrong too, that socio-cultural periods are cyclic, where dynasties give you a sort of a linear view of history. Typically, people say dynasties are cyclic. They rise and they fall, rise and fall, rise and fall. And people sometimes talk about it as a dynastic cycle and say, yes, but society, economy develop progressively. I'm not sure that they actually do develop progressively, but they're certainly not just cyclic. Okay?
Make it stellar. All right, thank you so much,
Okay.
Professor. We had a few other questions
Great.
that
Okay.
learners came
Let's
up with.
talk.
One interesting one was talking about the examination system and asking about the Song dynasty setting a precedent for the Chinese examination system, but having mentioned before that the
Right.
examination system was used in China.
And particularly in Han too.
Yes.
Yes. So this is why I sort of credit the examination system as beginning in Song, really the late 10th century, because it's only then that examinations are begin to be used to select the majority of officials.
I see.
Right? And eventually almost all officials will be chosen by the examination system. So even in the Tang dynasty, when the examination system becomes more and more important, it's probably at most 5% of officials are chosen via exams, except for very high officials. In the latter half of Tang, almost all prime ministers passed the examinations.
Okay. But were they chosen by the examination? Or they
Not,
just
not to be
happened
prime
pass?
minister, they just had passed.
I see.
I think for people who wanted a scholarly reputation, wanted to reach very high central office, passing the exams was always a good thing.
So it's majority
Right,
that you're using.
right.
to define.
So let's see, what do we have here? Oh yeah, we have some other questions. Examinations. You know, one of the ways the examinations was related to the economy
Yes.
is that when there's more wealth, it's easier for people to get an education.
That's correct.
Right?
And so we see that in the
Yeah.
Song.
We see that in Song, definitely. Private schools get founded. Private money supports printing, which makes information travel more broadly
Yes.
at a lower price, and so on.
We had another question about technological advancement, particularly gunpowder rockets affecting the battlefield.
So, you know, when I saw that question, I said, well, you know, we have a military encyclopedia from the 11th century, from the Northern Song. And we really have not talked a lot about military strategy and technology and things like this.
Yes.
So we should. And maybe next year we'll create a module all about that. So come
Sounds
back
like a
next
good
year.
idea. See you then. We had one other interesting question about the Tang, where it's so powerful as to expand across Central Asia into Northeastern Asia. How is it not powerful enough to defend itself from a single general?
An Lushan, right, when he rebels.
Yes.
Okay, so if you think about China is here, An Lushan and the East China Sea is over here. An Lushan is up there on the border. His garrison is there.
Yes.
So he's there to defend the border against the people to the north.
Yes.
But no one's back there defending the capital against him.
I see.
So it's very easy for him to move across the very flat North China Plain with his troops when he decides he wants to.
So it's
So
a matter of
sure.
geography and of the institution
And of,
itself,
and-
of
and- yeah,
trust of their defenders.
yes, indeed. Yeah.
I see. Great.
So there are other questions that we have, questions people ask that we don't have time to do,
Right.
but we do have some discussion questions. And the first one had to do with periodization. So we've talked about sort of an early imperial order in the beginning, in the Song in the Tang Song transition of the later imperial order. How can we understand this in terms of continuity and change? And we had some good answers.
We had some fantastic answers.
Mhm.
For example, we had Ian Davey, who broke things down
Mhm.
into categories. So dealing with continuity, this later imperial order society continuing to rationalize, institutionalize itself, focusing on merit rather than heredity,
Mhm.
and then changes in any number of aspects of living and life, nutrition, improved prosperity, transportation, and time. We had this sort of thinking echoed in Lucy Zhang's answer about how do we set the measurements how do we set the standards by which we evaluate this change, and her suggestion that we look at changes leading to impacts in lifestyle.
So you could talk, for example, about, I guess he does talk about this, from writing on writing scrolls on silk or on paper to printed books, for example, is a change. Right.
So it's a wonderful answer.
And Sergei Savin asks about thinking in terms of technological change, which is, I think, one of the ways that people often talk about change over time.
Absolutely.
Teo Hua Kwok.
Giving us quite a bit to think about in terms of the factors that lead to dynastic change. So, for example, inequitable distribution of powers, justice, oppression, corruption, and also the legacies of dynasties. And Teo Hua Kwok mentions, for example, administration and so goes through dynasty by dynasty administrative developments and legacies.
Good.
Fascinating
And
answer.
Marzian has some stuff really looking at the present, right?
Yes, but echoing
Yeah,
that idea
yeah,
of legacy.
yeah,
How
right.
can a legacy be evaluated?
How about Tianlu?
He mentioned the idea of dynasties providing a convenient terminology for us to think about history, but really the culture and developments that define the periods
Right.
from which dynasties sprang and responded
Right.
as worthy of our historical attention.
You know, it's interesting because our very first module, the big picture,
Yes.
began with the whole question of what dynasties were about and how we use that term. Dave Pomerantz. Now, Dave, you've been with us from the start, and you've just been wonderful in what you've written. And this is really great too about what were the most significant changes, what connected these changes, the underlying trends, and this is posted. We're not going to recite everything, Dave, but we have posted it for the other thousands of people to pay attention to.
Thank you so much.
Ideological shift from 750 to 1050, Philip.
A very important topic as well. And
Yeah,
the theme of
okay.
the unit. So we had Arizona Al,
Right.
for example, talking about the Tang model just not working anymore.
Right.
So a need for a new ideology, things falling apart, requiring people to think about what would give them better chances at personal and societal survival.
Yeah. And I think Gustan is making something of the same point, right?
Yes.
And that also with printing, for example, ideas could spread more quickly. And really, I think he sees an important point that soon marks the advent of a civil society.
Yes.
And Chin GHP.
With just a fantastic point that although there are ideological shifts in how things should be run, there is a constant idea that China should be a unified and ruled legitimately, which is
Okay.
a really interesting
Okay.
point.
Sufi DWC. Shift occurs based on the two great motivators, wealth and power. You can read on. Christian MGH. Ideological shift is a reflection of the many pressures on the Tang system. And she goes through a number of border controls, centralized economy, technological change. Willow, 123.
Fantastic answer talking about the weakening of hegemony in the north, the shift to a southern way of doing things in terms of production, land allocation, and also the government as a family business model
Right.
proving ineffective and
Right.
the requisite changes that occurred afterwards. We also had Stephanie Calvacante bringing our attention to the sort of conditions that create a need for new ideas. So the end of Tang Dynasty as demanding new ideas in the tax system, having circumstances that basically, in terms of history, lead us to the conclusion that each man belongs to his own time.
Right. So, in a sense, the times create the need. Right?
Yes.
MGH40 begins with chicken or egg.
Same question, times
Well,
creating the need.
Shiro. Ideological shift is attributed to the changes of underlying factors, economic center changes. Perspective of the individual towards the state changed. Well, that is in some sense an ideological shift, right? If that perspective changes.
Yes.
Technological progress, advanced geographic knowledge. In fact, technological progress printing advanced knowledge, which I think must have something to do with that.
How do you respond to the point about philosophy flourishing because Buddhism imported from abroad and renewal of Confucianism to counter the former?
Well, I'm not a great proponent of the notion, although it's well established in the literature that the new kind of Confucianism is a response to Buddhism. I actually think the new kind of Confucianism is very much more a moral philosophy versus cultural philosophy. I think that the shift here is towards personal morality and away from being a cultured person with the new kind of Confucianism. But we'll get to that later, why I say that. So we have two approaches to ideological change from Lou Graham. The clash of ideas.
And a few things mentioned to illustrate that. Ideas of hereditary power clashing with ideas of meritocratic power. Conflicting ideas of how the ideal economy should be run, and taking us back to the salt and iron debate, the idea of public versus property, market versus market control, materialistic values versus moralistic values, which
Right.
you just mentioned, and opposing ideas about the good life
Right.
in terms of the three teachings.
Right. And then he also talks about the changing changes in the material basis of society, citing sort of the Marxist view of that. Changes in the material basis necessitate economic reform, he argues. Well, I think that's right in the sense that if the government wants to stay in charge, have some purchase, some control over the economy, if the economy, if real economic circumstances change, the government better change too. Right? Political power follows economic power. State becomes economically dependent on the South rises in the economy. I guess that's true ultimately, right? That political power and economic power are related. But then he says new conceptions of the good life, right? So that's the question for me, is what's the conception of the good life that's emerging? I think one of the things we're going to see is that the conception of the good life is that it's really is sort of an integrated social order, and that the government's role is to make sure society develops in such a way that everyone has a place, everyone has a purpose, everyone has a role to play. In any case, we should stop here, and thank you all very much for spending this time with us this office hour, and welcome to the next module.
Thank you.
Okay? Oh, one last thing. We will be getting back to you about your kind offer, based on our request, of course, to donate to help us continue ChinaX's work. Thanks, bye.
Thank you.